Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I enjoyed our conversation yesterday so much, and I'm pleased to be here and talk with all of you again today. So thank you for the invitation again. And I need some help with time because I really lose sense of time when I'm talking. Can someone please give me the high sign? Oh, thank you. Can you let me know when there's 5 minutes left? You might have to really stand up, and that's great. Okay. So I want to talk with you about three things. So the first thing I really want to talk about is where the tension points are in existing regulation around data, and specifically around machine learning and data. And there are tension points that exist in current policy and regulation. And the most significant tension points are in what I call regulated data, or data dealing with very strong eligibility requirements. We'll talk more about that. Second thing I want to talk about is what happens when there are unregulated data sets. And then thirdly, I want to talk about a path forward and potentials where we might explore for progressing things along. So let's start. I just want to briefly describe to you my conception of privacy. I've worked on privacy almost 30 years now, and I've thought long and hard about this. And basically, I view privacy as a subset of autonomy. And fair information principles are a piece of that. They are not privacy, but they're part of it in a real fuzzy, complicated way. It looks more like this when you really actually start thinking about it. So privacy is a bit amorphous. It is a subset of autonomy, which is itself a bit amorphous. And FIPS are more clear. If you do not know what the fair information principles are, they are really global OECD ratified principles. However, they are not privacy, they are not autonomy. It all works together. So that's where I'm coming from, and that forms the kind of intellectual background for what I'm going to say. So let's pop into the tension points. This is the stuff that really I find endlessly fascinating. So I'm going to start with some US regulation first. So first, let's start with the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. So there has been so much discussion of discrimination. So let's make that discrimination meet the ground and see where the actual legal tension points are. So the tension point with the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, this was all in the what I call progressive regulation era, which is the 60s and 70s. So the ECOA, the entire idea behind ECOA was to prohibit discrimination in lending or all credit transactions. That is the entire focus and purpose. By the way, I will be sharing my slides, so please do not feel like you need to write all of this down. I just wanted to be complete because it's like a total flaw. Everything has to be complete. So basically, there are three important things for you to think about. There are prohibited factors in ECOA. That means if someone shows up and they want to borrow money, there are absolutely legally, federally prohibited factors you cannot mess with. Race, color, religion, national origin, sex, marital status, age, and also you cannot discriminate against a person because they are on welfare or other government assistance, and you can also not discriminate against them because they have taken an action under the Consumer Credit Protection Act, which is basically if they've sued someone like a bank, you can't discriminate against them. So those are major prohibited factors, and these prohibited factors are really important because when you talk to people about problems in machine learning and fairness, these will come up in kind of nebulous ways in the conversation. This is a big part of where they come from, as well as the Civil Rights Act. But in the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, it was put in a very specific context. So if you take a look at the required action, there are actually required actions in regards to credit reporting and credit transactions and whatnot. And so that becomes important. Scores were an important part of ECOA. So that's how machine learning plays in. Also, another really important point to notice in ECOA is that there are remedies we haven't talked about that so far in this fora. So a remedy is, if there's a harm, there's a fix for it. In ECOA, the Department of Justice can sue. There are multiple avenues of suing people who do not comply with this, and there have been a lot of lawsuits under ECOA. So if you really look at the definition of the credit scoring system that ECOA describes, it's your presentation yesterday, you were talking about how loose the law is and how direct machine learning is. This is a great example of it. The credit scoring has to be empirically derived, demonstrably and statistically sound. Great, right? Then there's some other qualifications, but they're very loose, and you can see it very quickly that it's loose. So just to try to distill that into something a little more visual, really we're looking at three things. We're looking at an input control, which is prohibited factors. So you're basically controlling the inflow. You're looking at certain required actions based on what you're attempting to do. So in this, it's a specification of use. In other words, you must have a certain type of scoring. If you're going to use a scoring system, and it needs to be a certain type. And then if something goes wrong, there are definite remedies. So now, poor Ed. Okay, pretend you're not hearing this, Ed. Okay? So I want to talk very briefly about an absolutely giant law called the Fair Credit Reporting Act. I am so not going to do it justice, but I'm going to pick out some of the most salient points for the discussion here. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is the definition of a credit score. And again, you'll see that it's enormously broad. So a credit score is a very, very, very focused item. It is a regulated chunk of data. It's scoring done on what's called a credit bureau report. Every single piece of this process is regulated to the teeth. The Fair Credit Reporting Act is a monumental piece of legislation that was passed in 1974. It is thorough, complete, and despite how thorough and complete it was, this is really what the definition is in the Act. So the thing I really want you to focus on here is one of the key things, when you boil it all down, one of the key things the Fair Credit Reporting Act does is it requires factorial transparency. And the factors that they had in mind weren't algorithms as factors. They were factors like, what is in your credit bureau report. Those are really the key factors. But that is the transparency here. And then something very, very important in terms of transparency in the Fair Credit Reporting Act is adverse action notice. So if you use one of these factors that has been in a credit score and that has impacted the credit score adversely, you get notified, and you get notified what factor blew your score. And then there's all these other rules that go with it. So you have to give people the range of the score, the top and the bottom. You have to give all the key factors that adversely impacted it, the date on which the score was run, which was really important back when this was passed, because there were very old scores at that time. I mean, really aged scores, very aged scores. And you also have to be able to get the file upon which the score was created. Now, just think for a moment, if you had to do this with your machine learning processes, just imagine what that would cause you to do procedurally. It's profound, really, when you think about it. This is a very narrow application, but imagine if this were writ large. Could you imagine someone writing to you, asking you to send them your factors that adversely impacted a decision? That's really something. So when you boil it down, we've got use limitation. In other words, you can't use it for just anything. You've got transparency again. You get an adverse impact notice. And you have accountability. Another thing we really didn't talk about yesterday. It's legal accountability as well. So the person who's providing the data, the furnisher of the data, has to be accountable. And then I just want to talk briefly, again, this is a complete information, but to boil this down, you have to promptly, if someone finds an error in their credit report, they have a legal right to correct that and dispute it. And if you find an error, there's certain actions you have to take. So There's a curing harm here, and there's a right to correction. So those are the tension points in some of the US scoring law. But there's another, and this is a much newer law. This is the General Data Privacy Regulation, GDPR, which is a European member union law. We don't know what's going to happen with Brexit yet. I think that's a bit up in the air. But I think they'll end up with a form of it. We'll have to wait and see. But GDPR is a huge, huge regulation. It's going into effect fairly soon, within, I guess, less than a year now, pretty much. And it's a huge regulation, and I'm just picking out a few salient points for you. I don't know if you're familiar with some of the really important aspects of GDPR for this conversation, but in the GDPR, there are special categories of data. And the special categories of data are important to note. They align a lot with the prohibited factors that are broadly used terminology in the US. But you really need to notice a couple of things. So first, sensitive data are data, not just data itself that is racial, but data that reveals this information. So it's also proxy data. It reveals racial or ethnic origin, political or religious beliefs, as well as genetic, biometric, and health data. The biometric edition was new. All right. So when you are processing or doing an analysis, and this includes statistical modeling and machine learning, when you're doing a process on any data that either reveals or is itself a factor that is sensitive data, then you are a high-risk processor, and you have special high-risk processing obligations under the GDPR. So the activities that fall under it are, and check these out, so systematic and extensive automated processing. What do you think that might possibly apply to, right? Large-scale processing of special categories of data. How many models have you used that have any of that data in it? I would suspect quite a few. We'll skip that one. And then other activities that are, check this out, likely to result in a high risk for the rights and freedoms of individuals. This is a big deal. This is, talk about a loose category. This is loose, it's important, and it's very difficult to interpret. But interpret it we must. So here's the boil down. Again, we have an input consideration. So I know there's a lot of discussion about black box, but when you really look at where policymakers have come down, they look at input. And they're like, let's control the factors, and let's list sensitive data categories. There's some controversy about that because in certain applications, especially big data analysis, almost any piece of data can become sensitive, as we all know. But there's the legislation, and that's what we have. High-risk processing is basically automated profiling. It's kind of a new category. And then there's a use limitation, which means if you are using that data of someone in the European Union, you must get consent before you automate it and use it for profiling. So what does this mean for you if you're building a model in Europe with any of the prohibited factors? It means you have to get consent. And then there is remedy in the GDPR. It's quite substantial financial remedies. So, how much time do we have? Okay, perfect. So just very briefly then, I want to talk about unregulated data. So this is a very typical data broker list. It's loaded with all sorts of data, and of course it is loaded with the data that we just talked about. There's Hispanic country of origin, there's working woman indicator. I mean, it's just amazing. It's a lot of pre-processed data, the Personix market segmentation. It categorizes a lot of data for you. So it's like ready-made, you know, for plugging into a model. It is. So if you use this and you pop out a model in Europe, there's some questions there. So I couldn't resist saying alternative credit score. Sometimes it's called aggregate. They are alternative facts. So basically, these are these function like a credit score, but they are based slightly differently. So these are US-based scores. They're also in other countries. But what they are is, so in the Fair Credit Reporting Act, the rights and responsibilities in the Fair Credit Reporting Act apply to a single individual. So the beautiful loophole that was exploited here is that this is the census block. So it's applying to like 4 households. Great. So 4 households get a credit score. And it's not based off of your credit data. It's everything else. It's all this stuff, right? So you're using all these prohibited factors, but you're not supposed to be using it to supply credit. Therefore, it's all cool. So this can be used for all sorts of things. They recommend using it for marketing purposes, so marketing financial products. Okay. So here comes our boil down. Are there any prohibitions on factors? There is one. You cannot use credit bureau information. Can you use proxy factors? Oh, yes. Can you use factors that are not released to people? Oh, yes. Where's the transparency? Here, I don't know that there is any, because you can't even get these scores. Quality, we don't know the approach, we don't know the validity, and we don't know the accuracy. What's the use, notification, or remedy? To my knowledge, there isn't any. There is some argument that could be made that this particular risk score, because it functions as a credit score for all intents and purposes, could possibly be regulated, but that's a really gray area argument. So therefore, we do have a real lack of constraint or remedy. So this is an unregulated score using typically more than 1,000 factors. I do not know if they're using algorithms as factors. I've never really been able to get a straight answer about what models they're using. But there's other important unregulated data sets. So health data that's held outside of HIPAA, a great example of this is the Precision Medicine Initiative, which is said to eventually have 1 million cohorts with biospecimens. HIPAA does not apply. Transactional data, for example, your wallet spend, that sort of thing, whatever you buy. Historic data sets, so which, the spending in the Los Angeles Watts district for the past 50 years, which data is available. So what does that say, and what kind of bias does that include? And then commercial data sets like, the Personics and whatnot, the error rate is always a question there. But that's kind of that's our landscape. That's what we're dealing with. So just briefly, in the few moments that I have left, I want to talk about the path forward. So I'm really, really interested in long tails. Most of my work in machine learning has been in convolutional neural networks and specifically applied to biometric data systems. I'm very interested in that. I will continue to be. I've really focused my efforts on this. Long tails are incredibly important. Outliers are very important because those are the people who call me and they have a problem. So what I would say to you is that, fraud detection outliers, that's the system. That's how it's supposed to work. I don't worry about the fraud detection system, not so much. If you disagree with me, you can talk with me. But with a long tail, you're talking about law enforcement action. If you're getting a false negative or a false positive in a law enforcement context when you're trying to travel, it's a really big deal. And it does happen. The people in the long tail, you don't hear about them a lot because they're in the tail. But there are lots and lots of people in the tail, and it's getting very difficult for them. And there's a lot of really good research on this. And I'm doing some of it too, and very pleased with some of the new work on the long tails, but I would encourage work on long tails and outliers. So I think that the most important thing I could possibly say here is that there are so many models, there are so many sectors and applications. The most important thing all of us could do right now is engage in a very serious multi-stakeholder process. It needs to happen at the expert level. The people in this room need to engage in this process with industry, with government, with academics. It needs to happen, and it's got to be a conversation. Okay, the conversation is, okay, here are the tension points. What are the best practices? So, I incorporated some ideas like how do you incorporate the spirit of existing fairness structures like ECOA and Fair Credit Reporting Act? How do you use those key tension points as a guide for best practices? how do you look beyond the formal model and look at the context for how to use the outcome of the model? So you've got this model, it's got an outcome, it sits in a context. The law enforcement uses, I think, are the most important. And then, of course, any eligibility use where you're being considered for employment, school, credit, those are all important. If there's a model being used to figure out what ad to show me, I don't care nearly as much about that as I do about the other issues. And then what are the remediations for data subjects? There's really almost no discussion about that. I cannot resist saying something about transparency in black boxes. So when people think of a black box, they think of a black box. When I think of the term black box, this is kind of what I think of. I'm like, okay, what's the structure in there? If I kind of know what the structure is, it doesn't bother me a lot. To me, this is not the hugest target for transparency. I'm really interested in micro decisions. In that area, there's some really interesting micro decisions that can be made, and I think some research can be done there. But in general, I would really like to find a new way to approach transparency as opposed to just focusing solely on the black box. And data does bite back, and I think it bites back the most when there's historical bias in data sets, and also when there's imbalanced data sets. And imbalanced data sets, I think, are something that's really important and I think under-researched still. And then just very quickly, how can all of this stuff be audited in a repeatable format and consistent repeatable format? What would a privacy threshold analysis look for? Either the factorial input, the pre-processing, the learning. What would a threshold analysis look like for that? I've seen a bunch, and some of them are just incredibly good, but I haven't seen enough. So I'd love to see more input on that. That would be a really good topic for a stakeholder process. What can be done for outlier issues that have impacts in the real world on individuals? And then, broadly speaking, what generalizable principles are stuck in all of your heads and we haven't talked about as a group enough? They're there. We need to surface them. And then something I always ask biometric audiences is this. So in the field of biometrics, it's really coming to the point where, if this were a mobile phone, people are at some point, because the training sets are so big, so cheap, and readily available, someone's going to walk around with a cell phone one day and point it at us and be able to biometrically identify us and make decisions about us based on that. It's going to happen. It's not an if, it's just a when. So instead of saying just say no to that, let's think about it a different way, which is, given that that will happen, what rules do you want to be in place? So for me, I'm very interested in interpretive rules, in use-based rules. Do we need constraints on the use? Do we need rules about interpretation? What social norms need to be in place about using biometric interpretation? This can be extrapolated to other types of models. But there you have it. So that's my take. I know there's a lot of questions. I've raised more questions than I've answered because that's where we are in this. But that's as it should be. I push forward the concept of a multi-stakeholder process, including all of you, continuing to talk about these very important issues. And then here's my email. I'd be happy to talk with you more about all of this, and that's it.